Hey everybody, today is Monday, May 13th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Civil War, editor Jake Roberts.
I was doing the sound mix for Brooklyn, and the guys who were working on that, who were the same team who did the sound for every Alex film, said, oh, there's this film we worked on last year that's absolutely incredible, and it's got a screening in London tonight. It's called MACHINA, and I got a ticket and went, and I just was completely blown away. I mean, I was pinned to my seat, and the next day rang my agent and I said, he's out of my league, but if that guy is ever looking for an editor for anything, sign me up, please. When you read something, you're looking for indicators of what the director or the writer, or in this case, the same person, is trying to get across. And so it was very obvious that he wasn't trying to discuss the specifics of American politics. It was sort of undecodable because you got the biggest red state and the biggest blue state side by side, and therefore, how do you interpret that? It was definitely a self-conscious indicator from Alex to the audience. Don't bother trying to unpick this along party lines. This is not what I'm trying to do. Obviously, some people have taken that to be, how stupid are you as a British person that you don't understand America? And it's like, well, obviously not that stupid.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, greetings, my fellow Americans and other friends from around the world. And what a world we live in, I tell you. But this podcast is our safe space where we talk about editing and filmmaking, and we can forget, for an hour or so, the crazy times we live in. Unless the film we're talking about is Alex Garland's Civil War. Civil War is an intense extrapolation of what kind of dystopia might await a not-so-United States. And that statement probably requires a little more explanation, so I will do my best. Civil War follows a team of journalists, featuring Kirsten Dunst as photojournalist Lee Smith, traveling from New York to Washington, D.C. during a civil war between an authoritarian federal government and several regional factions, most notably the so-called Western Forces of California and Texas. Well, there's a concept. And also a hint that this film is not a reflection of current politics or political divide. In fact, the film never really discusses politics or the political agenda of the rebel faction or the government they're rebelling against. And having seen the film, I found that to be a very clever and subversive way of handling the biases the audience will bring with them going into the film. It is a clever movie made by talented filmmakers. First, you have director Alex Garland, who really made a name for himself with the film Ex Machina. A lot of people love that movie, including myself. The editor behind the Avid, or in front of it, once again, it's all about perspective, that editor is Jake Roberts. This is Jake's second outing with Alex in regards to feature films. Their first film together was Garland's Men, which was a precursor of sorts to Civil War. But Jake and Alex actually first worked together on the TV series Devs. And you're going to hear all about that, plus all the fascinating choices the two made and employed for Civil War. But first, you get to hear what kind of spin I'm going to put on the two messages I do so often here with you on the show, starting with our pals at Extreme Music. My friends, it is no secret who intelligent storytellers turn to when they need the very best in production audio. Why, of course, it's Extreme Music and their legendary roster of A-list musicians and composers, all gathered together to provide you with a vast catalog of top-shelf tracks. And they make it so easy to find the music that you're looking for, using metadata like lyrics, tempo, genre, composer. You can even show Extreme Music what you need by uploading a reference track to them so they can find you ones just like it. You can even do the licensing right there on their website, or get a tiny bit of help from one of their reps at an office near you. The whole thing is absolutely free to try, and I think lots of fun to do. So do not wait, young storyteller. The next time you have a movie or TV show to make it with great production audio from Extreme Music. Okay, here's a question for you. How often have you listened to The Rough Cut and thought to yourself, golly, I wish I could read the podcast instead of just listening to this guy who talks way too fast? Maybe never, but what if I threw in behind-the-scenes photos or Spotify playlists of the needle drops from the movie or TV show we're talking about? Or Avid timelines or YouTube videos explaining some of the topics or techniques discussed on the show? That sounds pretty good, right? Well, it is. And you can get all that at blog.frame.io/theroughcut, where you can see these things and still hear the podcast via the embedded podcast player. It is a great way to enjoy the podcast and learn a little more in the process. Once again, that's blog.frame.io/theroughcut to experience the multimedia extravaganza version of the podcast. Okay, showtime. And a first-time guest on The Rough Cut. Please welcome from Civil War, editor Jake Roberts. Film, you just can't avoid the fact that the audience is going to come into this film with their own biases, prejudices, preloaded going into a film like this. I figured where we should start is what Alex said to you about the film and what he wanted to achieve with it.
Well, he sent me the script to Men and the script to Civil War on the same day, still in lockdown. And when I last had seen him at the end of Editing Devs, which was a TV show we'd done together where I'd cut all 8 episodes of it, he was writing a different TV show about civil disobedience. And that was the last I heard. And then being Alex, 3 months later, he rings me up and says, I've got 2 screenplays I've written. And I said, what happened to the TV show? And he said, oh, I changed my mind. And the plan was to shoot them back to back, originally Men and then Civil War, and then cut them back to back. And then for various reasons, largely COVID related, because Men we were able to do on a smaller scale. It is essentially a 2-hander in a country house. So that was quite easy to do within COVID restrictions. But obviously something on the scale of Civil War and the amount of people involved, that just wasn't practical at that point. But really, he just wanted to know what I thought. I mean, he doesn't preload the sort of conversation. It's really, what do you think? Are you up for it? That's the whole conversation, really. You know, he talked probably about stylistic things, because I think in the past, all of the things he's directed have been very carefully composed, and they're also quite sort of still films. There's a lot of people sitting and talking, and this obviously was going to be a much more kinetic, much less controlled ride, quite literally. So I was curious about how loose an aesthetic he was going to go for, but how handheld would it end up being. And he was quite determined that it wouldn't be full, as he described it, sort of free jazz with it. But at the same time, he was going to have less control than he would have had in the past and other things. And so that was definitely something we talked a bit about. But in terms of, I mean, the subject matter was baked in and the title is the title. And so, but at the same time, it was apparent that really his concern wasn't to make a broad political statement. It was really telling the story of these specific people going through this specific experience, and the context was really the backdrop to the drama. And so it wasn't, we're trying to make a political statement here at all. It was just, we're trying to tell this story and this is where it's set. And I thought it was too interesting a proposition not to get on board with.
You know, what you hear about the film is that the united forces of Texas and California, the Western forces, are, trying to stage a coup. And you look at it from the real world and it's like, well, Texas and California couldn't be more perceived to be different. I mean, I think the truth is somewhere in a different place, but there really is no sense of what the political movement is going on in this film. And by the time the movie is over, you don't really know what the politics of either side were. You know that there's sort of a tyrannical government in place and that the rebels, I guess we'll call them, are on the right side of history. Again, it's so much more complicated than that. Well, when you read the script, were there any specific things that you made note of or any questions like I just asked you with the politics?
It was very obvious from the script that he was the character of the president, which currently the film starts with Nick Offerman's character giving a speech. You saw even less of him than you do in the current film than it's scripted. He was only ever this distorted image on a TV screen where you couldn't even hear what he was saying. And so that was really the most overtly political pointer in the screenplay. So when you read something, you're looking for indicators of what the director or the writer, or in this case, they're the same person, is trying to get across. And so it was very obvious that he wasn't trying to discuss the specifics of American politics. So I just put that back in my mind. And it's interesting. I mean, the Texas, California of it all, I mean, we couldn't get anyone to even hear that. Any of the rough cuts that we presented people sort of dropped later in the film. And also the fact that the trailer put that right at the beginning, suddenly the whole world got hold of this piece of information that every time we'd shown people the movie, they were like, what? They didn't even pick up on that detail at all previous to that. So the fact that it's become such a sort of hot button issue was kind of fascinating because, it was obviously a very intentional thing for Alex. It was sort of undecodable because you got the biggest red state and the biggest blue state side by side. And therefore, how do you interpret that? It was definitely a self-conscious indicator from Alex to the audience. Don't bother trying to unpick this along party lines. This is not what I'm trying to do. Obviously, some people have taken that to be, how stupid are you as a British person that you don't understand America? And it's like, well, obviously not that stupid.
You already talked about how, he wanted to be different than some of the things he's done in the past. Not exactly freeform jazz, but a little wilder, a little looser. Did he give you other films to say, this is kind of what I'm going for, Jake?
The film that was, and not for a second are we trying to put ourselves in that company, but the most obvious touchstone for the film, not stylistically, but sort of structurally and sort of spiritually in a way, was Apocalypse Now. We just talked about the sort of aesthetics of it and some of the cutting rhythms, but not really ever to emulate, just as a sort of point of interest. And, I'd obviously seen the film Come and See, which I know is a big thing for Alex, but again, we never consciously discussed it as let's either definitely do this or not do this because these other people did in this other film. And I don't really ever have those conversations with filmmakers, to be honest. I mean, I'm often asked in retrospect, oh, you were very consciously copying this film. And usually I've never even seen the film in question. I mean, maybe I am, or maybe the director has and they haven't told me. But we're always just trying to make the film we're making, and inevitably in the same way that people keep stealing the choruses of other people's songs these days, because there's only so many chord orders you can put chords in. And there's just so many more movies now that you're always going to stray into the common territory.
Well, before we start dissecting the film itself, one more quick question about you and Alex. You mentioned you started working with him, I think about 5 years ago on Devs.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about how you guys met and the things you talked about to establish that you'd be a good fit for one another.
My first awareness of Alex was reading The Beach, the novel, before it became a film. And then I was doing the sound mix for Brooklyn, and the guys who were working on that, who were the same team who did the sound for every Alex film, said, oh, there's this film we worked on last year that's absolutely incredible, and it's got a screening in London tonight. It's called MACHINA, and I didn't know anything about it. So just on the recommendation of the people I was working with that day, I got a ticket and went. And I just was completely blown away. I mean, I was pinned to my seat. And the next day, rang my agent and said, he's out of my league, but if that guy is ever looking for an editor for anything, sign me up, please. And 2 years later, I got a phone call from my agent saying, Alex would like to meet you for a project. And I thought, oh, wonderful, my agents have done their job. And actually it turned out that Alex had contacted them independently because he'd seen a film that I'd done a recut on and had been impressed by what he'd heard about the film prior to my involvement, and then subsequently seen the film. Where they're like, well, that ended up being a lot better than I'd been told it was. So that got me in the room, I guess. And then, I don't know, I always think you get the job or don't get the job the second you walk in the room. And people either have an intuitive feeling about that you're going to blend well together or not. And it's rather like if you go house hunting, the minute you walk through the front door of a house, you can pretty much tell.
Yeah.
And someone else will walk through the same front door and have the exact opposite experience to you. So, it's not to say that I will only get the jobs that I'll get, but that vibe with the director, I can't predict it. And and sometimes I might feel that on my side and they don't feel on their side. I'll come out and go, that was a fantastic meeting. Pretty sure I got that one. And then you never hear from them again. And vice versa. Sometimes you walk in and think it was a dreadful meeting and there was no vibe, and then you heard out you got the job. But I mean, I've always tended to get on really well with the directors I've worked with, so put it that way. And Alex is no exception. Alex is a really great and interesting guy to spend a year in a room with. So that's been a huge privilege. And had he not just retired himself, I would have hoped it continue. But
I'm hoping that's not true.
We'll see. I don't think any of us. He never said retiring indefinitely. He said he was just going to take a pause. But
we all need a break every once in a while.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
As I understand it, the film was shot primarily in Atlanta. Where were you cutting?
Some directors really like you to be kind of nearby during a shoot because they might want to, they at least think they want to spend their weekends coming into the cutting room and looking at stuff. I was able to do the assembly while they were shooting from my place where I live in the UK in Somerset. And these days they release great drive systems where the media will migrate just so the DIT in Atlanta will put it onto a server, which will go to my assistants in London and they can site sync it and create the bins. And then by osmosis overnight, all of that data will flow into a box that I have in Somerset. And then by somewhere between 12 to 18 hours after they've shot something, I can be cutting it on the other side of the world. Most of that workflow wouldn't really be any different were I in Atlanta anyway. And actually, because of the time change, Alex would get on a phone to me at the end of my day, but beginning of his shoot day, and say, how was yesterday? He'd want reassurance that he'd got what he thought he got, but at the same time, the nature of the schedule was there was no going back to get anything. If I'd said, oh, we didn't get that shot, there wasn't really a lot we could do about it. One of the things about this film is it was shot completely in sequence. Men was done the same way. Devs was not, although Devs was done within its own little ecosystems. Primarily, it was sort of the cube was shot in the sequence of the cube and things like that. So, I mean, I think most actors, directors would like to work in that way if they can. There's obviously usually very real practical financial reasons why it's not practical. But in this case, I don't think there's a single exception to anything being shot out of sequence. Other than the only thing being out of chronological is that was the Nick Offerman speech sections, that was actually the first shoot day, because it had to be on the background of TV, because scene 4 had Kirsten watching him on the screen in the hotel room. So it was like, well, rather than having a blue screen, and because it was decontextualized from the story, there was no upside to sticking it later in the schedule. So that was the first stuff shot. But it was nowhere at all where the script started. I think the first 5 scenes that were written out ultimately. But otherwise, no, the story of the guy, people in the car, the journalist, that was 100% in sequence.
I would imagine that would be kind of beneficial for you as the editor crafting the story. Is it? And how does it pay off for you doing it that way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I always think as the editor, primarily, you are literally the first audience for the film. And so I was, in a very slow, repetitive way, seen it 37 times, but at the same time, I was having the linear experience of going on that journey. And I think what it certainly affords you is because so many of the editorial decisions you make are about the emotional context of what's just happened before. And if you, as with a lot of traditional films, you start with scene 70 and then do scene 23, and then obviously almost 100% of the decisions you're making on that first assembly are sort of wrong, whether you finally put them in context, because you suddenly go, oh, of course they weren't going to cry there, or, you know, like, even though it was good that the actor cried, it felt good out of context. It makes no sense. But when you're putting it together in sequence, you're making at least the correct decisions for the context of the previous set of decisions you made. So by the end of your first assembly base is a lot less bumpy because you put it together with the full knowledge of what's just come before each time. So that really helps. You don't go down so many cul-de-sacs, but by making a set of decisions, you are excluding a whole bunch of possible alternatives. And of course, sometimes the director will come in and go, no, let's go back and completely change the context of scene 3, in which case then you have to recut the whole film again. But anyway, at least in terms of that first cut, it's just more fun as an experience because you are literally, you are seeing the film unfold before you instead of jumping all over the place. And for me, again, I'll read a script, but then I usually try not to pay too much attention to what the script said when I'm putting it together. I sort of think that Alex is someone who will change a lot on the day, depending on if the actors aren't feeling a certain thing or if just the location doesn't allow for the way he wrote the blocking of a scene or something. You know, you have to be very reactive to things. And so often if you're tracking something on the page, go, this isn't what it said, you get yourself confused. But if something seems to me to be the most apparent thing about a scene, then that is sort of valid. So I might put it together in a very different way than the director intended, but that sometimes be a good thing, you know, and they might suddenly learn something that they didn't anticipate and go, oh, okay, that's interesting, you've done it like that. So I kind of allow for and almost encourage the kind of whatever it is that I'm feeling based on watching the scene 57 times and then that's sort of how I'll go into it. And then if ultimately they go, no, I really want to have it much more like exactly what I wrote, then that takes 10 minutes to put together when they're in the room with you. You know, it's not that hard. The main drawback with that, as I've found, is that day 1 or 2 or 3 of a film shoot is usually not everyone's best day. You know, the crews never worked together before. Everyone's just finding their feet. And yet you obviously always want to start a film on strong, confident footing. So the scenes that Alex had written to start the movie for all sorts of reasons weren't strong enough. It started with Kirsten's character, Lee, on an aeroplane coming into land. She'd been overseas on an assignment, so she was sort of seeing America for the first time with her own eyes in this state. And then she met Joel at the airport, and then Joel actually gave a long speech in the car, which, funnily enough, would have been a lot of the context that people are sort of clamoring for. But anyway, we were just never happy with those scenes, and we tried really hard for months trying to make them work. And eventually Alex came in one day and said, I had a dream last night and remembered that we'd shot all this extra footage of Nick's character, the president, practicing his speech. And he pitched this sort of concept to me and I put it together and we both looked at each other and were like, yeah, that's the way to start the film. But it was a sort of improvised moment which I'd completely forgotten he'd shot. And I sort of put it together and we never really changed it other than the interstitial real world media intercuts. That was the only thing that really changed from that first time I put it together. But it just suddenly felt like, okay, that's the way to start the film. And then we moved to the scene where Kirsten's character's watching the speech, which actually came after the bomb originally, that and put that front as well, which again just gave more context for everyone and just felt more assertive. And, you know, you lean into the kind of what's this going on in this world.
So when I'm watching a movie and I'm making notes, you don't often realize until you look back on all the notes how important one element is. And needle drops are always important. Mm-hmm. That first needle drop is going to play a bigger role in setting the tone than possibly the other one. So you have the Love Fingers by Silver Apples playing out. I admit it's a song I didn't know before the film.
No, nor me.
The needle drops in this film are all over the place stylistically. What really drove them? Was it the message of the song? No,
what I'd say is, I mean, none of them came easy. There was a huge amount of trial and error. And sometimes we'd sit on something for a long time. And then sometimes you have a newer, better thought, or you get bored of something, or sometimes you just simply can't clear it. There was a few cases where we either couldn't afford something or couldn't track down the writers or whatever it was. So, but no, I mean, I think it just comes down to sort of gut feeling. And some of some of them are very counterintuitive, but that's sort of Alex's nature. I mean, the day we put on the De La Soul track on that thing, I mean, it was like, this isn't going to work. And it sort of doesn't work, but at the same time, we both looked at each other and were like, it kind of weirdly does sort of work. We had the whole sequence cut to, let's say, myriad different tracks prior to that, and then you move a few edit points to hit some beats or not, or however you want to do it. But we didn't really change much, and the dissonance of it kind of just was part of what we liked about it. But you don't really examine it beyond that. I mean, that's sort of the way with Alex. He's very intuitive. He wrote the whole screenplay for Civil War in 10 days, and there's no revisions or rewrites with Alex. Like, his scripts usually got a few typos and they'll go right to the shooting script. Since I've worked with him anyway, there's never been a second draft of anything. It's what comes out of his brain as a sort of stream of consciousness, and that's what we end up shooting. He has enough sort of weight of character that people go along with, I guess. I mean, most people wouldn't get away with it, but Alex somehow, the studio come up with the money and the actors sign on board. No actor's ever going to give him a note about their character. They may well, but he won't do it. So that's how he writes. And again, with some of the scenes, when it hits the right tuning fork, you don't change it after that. He's felt it on a certain level, and then you just move on and try and get the right tune with the next scene or the next sequence or whatever. And it was a kind of case-by-case basis. The Silver Apples thing, that was a suggestion by Jeff Barrow, one of our composers, but also he's a sort of musical taste barometer. Alex knew the song and loved it, but I'd never heard it before. I guess one of the reasons why Alex and I work well together is we tend to agree when we think something's right, even when it's wrong.
One of the first scenes of the movie is a protest in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And there's a suicide bomber. And the bomb goes off, and then it's just total silence except for the sound of the shutters and some cameras. Mm. And it reminded me of The Last Jedi. Okay. They take out the sound completely, and it really throws the audience. There's quiet, and then there's silence. Was that something you always had in mind, or was something in the process you did? And was it true silence? Did you go right down to like a 0 on the noise floor?
Yeah, no, it was true silence, which is quite hard because I've done a few films now with silence involved, and it's never before been literally bare-assed, nothing coming through the speakers, silence, because everyone gets very comfortable. The sort of standard industry belief is that you'll just hear too many people rustling their popcorn, or even if it's sub-perceptual, you put something through the speakers. But Alex was quite determined it was just going to be absolutely nothing. But that came again pretty late. There was a long period where we were doing the kind of classic tinnitus kind of high pitch ringing, which we've all heard a million times. And we were sort of going down that path, which was more familiar. And again, in Alex's style, is if something feels too familiar or rote, he tends to want to not do it. So eventually, at a certain point, he was like, no, let's just go absolute silence. And there was a bit of resistance from the sound team at first, but that's where we ended up. And then, yeah, of course, the nature of the shutters, and they are actually the sounds of the respective cameras that they use. Cailee's camera sounds different to Kirsten's camera, and the device of showing photos in the film was definitely written into the script to some extent, but we absolutely had to sort of commandeer it and embellish it in post, retrofit a lot of that. So we were never meant to see the image that Cailee took of Kirsten, but we created that in post, and sort of that device of setting up. They each have this kind of voice.
Going back to your note about this being shot in sequence, a scene soon after the one we just discussed is Lee's taking a bath and she's reflecting. Mm-hmm. You see a montage of things she's covered in the past.
Yeah.
Knowing Alex's approach to this, what footage did you have to draw from? Did Alex just shoot a lot of things, not specific, but just sort of wartime type events?
Yeah, I mean, the film used to open with a more extended flashback that is the horrific image of the guy being set on fire with the tire around him. That was sort of the end of the opening scene, which was a sort of non-specific. Pretty much all of the acts of extreme violence in the film are drawn from actual either news reports, or they're all things that absolutely have happened, or sometimes in specific things, or sometimes just something that Alex had seen or read about. But that kind of quick montage of all sorts of conflicts was, again, a sort of editorial contrivance that we came up with. They were more specific flashbacks dotted throughout the film for these characters, and then we just sort of amalgamated them all into one and actually embellished it with taking footage that was actually shot for other bits in the film to sort of make it feel like it happened.
Something else I wondered as I was watching the film was the relationship between Joel and Lee. You never really established that. Mm-hmm. Were they romantically involved? What kind of history do they have together? Was that ever explored more in previous cuts?
Absolutely. In terms of the scenes I've already discussed cutting, I mean, that was exactly those scenes. And had the scenes ended up being great scenes, would we have kept them as possible? And certainly it would have filled in a lot of the questions. But, it was only ever subtly inferred. I mean, again, with Alex's style of writing, it's not sort of that on the nose, but there was a lot more implied backstory, and you would have understood their personal relationship. But again, once you sort of start weighing up the pros and cons of cutting things, because I mean, everything's written for a reason. I mean, it's not a scene in the script if it doesn't serve a function. So in any film, when you cut something out altogether, you're always weighing up, can we live without it? How much does it hurt us not to have this piece of information? And, we just decided that really their backstory ultimately wasn't as important as more quickly and efficiently setting up the relationship between Lee and Jesse. And there was an allusion to, specifically because Jesse, again, we cut the text from a later scene with the one in the football stadium where Jesse actually asked Lee whether her and Joel had ever been involved together, and she said no. And again, we just decided to sort of sidestep that whole kind of subtext and subplot. It wasn't a big plot anyway, it didn't really go anywhere. I think the film has quite a lot of languidity in it. It has a lot of air in it, but at the same time, we try to make it as tight as possible. The only way to do that is by not keeping all the scripted words in there and taking out all the space. You just have to remove 50% of the dialogue from every scene, essentially, to kind of keep the thing going along.
Going back to the president's speech, practicing the speech, it's just the touchstone that you go to throughout the film. Alex writes one script and doesn't change it much. Hearing you talk about how you reworked it in the beginning makes me wonder, how well planned was that throughout the rest of the film? And what drove your decisions there?
All those placements were pretty much exactly what was written. I'd say the big difference was that in the script, you just couldn't understand 90% of what he was saying. But Alex had written out the text in full anyway, so Nick acted it on the day. And it had been the scripted intention to only hear every third word because it was always being distorted. And then in the end, we decided just to, for the most part, have it fully intelligible. But the placements of those, I think that was always sort of Alex's intention with those. Just to kind of keep you connected to that, what is the ultimate sort of mission of getting to sort of keep you checked in with that, because that is really the only allusion to the outside world beyond their subjective kind of perspective. And even though you're not meant to believe a word he's saying, in a way you can kind of infer that whatever he's saying is the opposite of the truth.
Ultimately, this is among all the things it's a road picture. Mm-hmm. They're traveling from New York to D.C.
An implausibly long 857-mile route.
Yes. Well, how long is this really going to take? So you do have title cards for the distance from D.C.
Yeah, that sort of came out of, I can't remember, someone gave us a note about that saying it would really help. It seemed relatively plausible that you could say, okay, well, they have to take this weird route because any kind of interstate would be utterly unusable. I mean, as you say, we shot it all in Atlanta. So topographically, I don't think it's particularly accurate to what New Jersey or Pennsylvania looks like. We didn't go out of our way to, I think we added one digital state line sign that was sort of at a certain point as a marker. I mean, that was one of the things is we did have limited production. I mean, an awful lot of the budget of the film was reserved for the DC section. So the road trip section was at times super guerrilla by nature, and sort of a lot of the things they're driving by are just undressed parts of America that just do look slightly apocalyptic. I mean, we added the odd burnt out car, but otherwise the kind of desolation and a lot of that stuff is just what it looked like. And with the odd digital embellishment to sort of turn it more into our world. But we got a lot of free production value from just the state of.
I was going to make a joke about you guys shooting in Detroit, but I don't want to lose any listeners. Yeah. I think I told you this, that I was listening to a presentation by editor Joe Walker, mm-hmm. and he just, apropos of nothing, brought up Civil War and your work and said, if you haven't seen this movie, you got to see this movie. And the way that they employed the stills, just really brilliant in how they did it. And it's certainly been done before, but very effectively here. And I'd like to know just the process for doing that. Were they still images pulled from the actual footage or real still shot in the moment? How did you approach doing that?
It was always in the script that there would be some of these employed. So Alex gave the actors, so Cailee really had real film in her camera, and she was learning how to use it and operate it properly. And so she was taking real analog stills throughout, and we got her contact sheets, and where at all possible, we've used them in the film. And Kirsten was shooting digitally, so that some of the stills are the actor's own. And some were then shot by Rob Hardy, our DOP, with a view to specifically, the intention of them was to break them down and turn them into stills. And then some of them are just repurposed footage from the film, because there were certain sequences that had never been intended we were going to use that device. But then once we started using the device, we realized that it both served as a sort of illustration of what the characters were doing, but also in some way there was a sort of character element to it. So sometimes, we would like a sequence like the shootout at the sort of office block complex thing, which has quite a heavy use of stills. We had to recreate all those in post. But yeah, I think it ended up being an effective device, and the sort of sound design aspect of it, I think, breaks up the Gunfire in an interesting way.
Well, once you start doing that, do you establish certain rules? Like when I do a still, I'm going to stay on for this long every time?
Yeah, that was a bit of trial and error when there was some are just sort of individual stills and some are like a quick flick book, so you get 3 in a row. We ended up on I think it was 18 frames. I can't remember now. But a lot of trial and error of how long they should be. The sound of each one is always the right click of the thing. And then I think ultimately in the offline, there was never any sound underneath them. But I think then Glenn and his team, the sound designers, ended up putting a sort of sub-bassy kind of rumble.
In these very immersive battles, there's gunfire going off all around the audience, sometimes more than other times. How much of that do you labor to do? And do you do an actual sort of 5.1 or surround setup in the cutting room?
On the current film I'm working on, we've got 5.1. On Civil War, we just had a stereo setup. But I mean, in answer to your question, I'll always do quite a lot of sound design myself at an early stage, or in conjunction with my assistants. Because I find it's quite hard to judge a scene without it if you sense that's where it's going to end up. You know? And in this case, a lot of the gunfire we had for free anyway, because they were shooting, I can't remember what the name of when they shoot the blanks that actually make a very loud noise on set, which was quite traumatizing for the actors. But it meant that literally the dailies were covered in really good gunfire. So I think ultimately very little of it was in the final film, but Alex always insisted that Glenn and the sound team used them as the basis. There was particularly in that sequence in the office blocks, there was a particular slap echo that Alex had got it was very distinctive to him on the day, and it was a lot of work to recreate that in post, but exactly the way it sounded on the day. So it just sounded unlike any gunshot that he had ever heard on film before. And I think the nature of the gunshots and the volume of them, and also just the quiet, a lot of scenes, they come out of quietness as well, so that it's more shocking for that. We did a lot of that in the Avid, and then made much better by Glenn and his guys.
What I've heard you say already about Alex, my takeaways are that he seems to be very economical in his shooting style. How would you quantify or qualify, I'm not even sure what the right word is, the type of coverage you get and the amount of footage you get from Alex?
For someone who started as a writer, he's incredibly sort of edit conscious. So he shoots more than enough coverage for any scene, because he just understands that you need a lot of angles to make something play compellingly. And I've very, very rarely felt undercovered by him. There's a few scenes in this film that I'm thinking specifically of, not Sammy's death exactly, but the bit where he reveals that he was been shot after the Jesse Plemons scene. That was incredibly undercover. That was like 2 takes of the whole scene. That was it, because there was no more light in the day. But other than that, generally speaking, he's very conscious of, it can be boring for the actors to shoot, and it's sort of a dirty word these days of shooting coverage, but actually editorially it's a great thing to have 4 or 5 sizes down the line on each actor saying each line, so you've always got somewhere to go for extra emphasis. I like to orientate the audience to understand where everyone is in a scene, and some directors sort of have a blind spot with that. Everyone's just in their own little ecosystem, and you can't really tell the interrelate of where they are spatially in relation to each other. And Alex is always very, very good at kind of both getting the coverage and the dialogue, but also the kind of the blocking, getting a sense of the blocking. So in that respect, it was no different to when I've worked on the more studio films with him. But yeah, I think it was just a slightly more looser aesthetic and less control over the frames and the lights. Exactly.
Of all the great scenes that I could ask you about, the one that I said, no matter what kind of time we have in this interview, I have to make time for the Jesse Plemons scene.
Mm-hmm.
I have to call it the Jesse Plemons scene because his character doesn't have he doesn't even have a credit.
I know.
He's not even credited in the movie.
I think in an ideal world, the audience wouldn't know he was coming until he shows up. And of course, A24 couldn't resist sticking him in the trailer, and that's fair enough, and they have to sell the movie.
He is the trailer.
I know. But no, it would have been great for him to just appear. I think it's been widely reported, so it's not indiscreet of me to say that I think he was cast 4 days before we shot the scene. A different actor was going to play the part, and then for scheduling reasons had to drop out. And we knew it was, like, in theory, the best scene in the film, and it was a great part. And yeah, who was going to play it? And Kirsten said, I don't think Jesse's doing anything. I think he'll do it. And we were like, oh, thank God, And it could not have been better. I mean, no disrespect to the person who would have otherwise played it, who is also a phenomenal actor. I don't think any of us now could imagine it being anyone else. And wow, I mean, he is just terrifying.
He was so good in this scene, and the scene itself is so good. I'll just give it a bit of a setup. The traveling party, our heroes, run into these 2 militants. Jesse's one of them. They're kind of cornered. But one of the party, Sammy, gets away before Clemens isn't aware that Sammy's sort of hiding.
Yeah.
And the tension and the performances, the editing, everything about it is so good that I honestly forgot about Sammy. So that when a truck comes roaring in at the last second to save them, my first thought was, who's that? And then I'm like, of course it's like, how did you not remember that? It was only 4 minutes ago, but something in the recipe of what you all did in that scene was so good that I forgot that he was there.
Okay, well, that's good news. No, I sort of did. I mean, I kind of do too, because I mean, you know, Jesse's just so compelling, and your brain is just hopefully just stuck in that mode. I think that's, I mean, often with, not that it was a huge twist, but I mean, I think so often in films with twists, it's like the answer is you hopefully give the audience enough information that when something unexpected happens, it isn't just totally out of the blue. You know, you kind of go, in retrospect, you go, oh, of course that thing, but you've just kept them, you've sort of shown them the magic trick, but then distracted them enough to then they don't think about it. But I think these things only pay off for satisfying if you don't feel cheated. You know, if we hadn't set up that Sammy was there, then it would have felt completely unearned. But I mean, anyway, I mean, a friend of mine was taking his task a little bit, but I mean, he said it works, you got away with it, but the sort of contrivance of the fact that these guys wouldn't hear the massive truck coming behind them in a film that's sort of supposedly naturalistic was sort of a bit hard to, but I think in the heat of the moment, we hopefully got away with it.
I think you did.
I mean, editorially, when an actor's giving a performance of that, you just try and get out of the way, really. You know, you're trying not to be too cutty, and Jesse's someone who does big variety within his takes. So, I mean, the choice of which great version of the line to use is the hardest bit, really, because and some of those lines are improvisations, not massive, but there was the show me state thing was here, and when Cailee does, I don't know, she was really confused, she didn't know, and she does. So it was a genuine response from the actor, who is from Missouri, but doesn't know why it's called the show me state. That was one of the only scenes in the film. I think we took 2 days to film that section of it, but it was a lot of fun to do, and it was a gift. I mean, those ones, they take the longest to assemble because you want to do them justice. Then actually, in terms of the overall editing, the months of editing, we didn't do an awful lot to that scene after, because it just worked right out the gate. I mean, for me, one of the biggest decisions, in retrospect, became a sort of obvious thing that we just applied across the whole film, but at the time, my instinct was at a certain point to use some score in it. And Alex was fairly determined to leave it dry, and that became a sort of stylistic template for the film as a whole, that we just never use underscore, really, I think, ever, certainly to denote tension, which, you know, on the one hand, it's the most obvious crutch one has as a filmmaker to promote tension, but at the same time, I think it does make things feel much more real. You know, you don't know that's why it feels more real, but you just don't feel like you're being manipulated in any way particularly, which I think actually makes it more compelling. And throughout the film, we use music as score, but it's almost always at the end, just to sit in an emotion for a while, we never run it under a scene to sort of create the emotion.
You know, earlier you mentioned that more of the VFX work is going to be done towards the end of the film. You also talked about how you enjoy doing sound design if you can. What's your take on VFX? Do you lean into that as well? And what kind of things did you have to do in the Avid, or did you even bother to do in the Avid?
I mean, in terms of the Avid, we had our VFX team on, right, you know, from the beginning, and Alex is very VFX savvy, and he understands that if you want to get certain shots done, you have to make decisions early and then commit to them. So we sort of looked at certain big shots in DC and gave them to VFX within the first week or two and said, we won't change this shot, like whatever it happens. So they were able to work up principles without wasting the resources of doing it on a shot that you then end up chucking out. So we gave them a bunch of things to work off, but we didn't obviously have a lot of, for all of the early rough cuts, you know, you're having to leave a lot to the imagination. But on the thing I'm working on now, there's more resources, and we had much more temp in for this. We had, months and months of just blue screens in a car park, which is unfortunately how a lot of DC was created. But, you know, I find it quite easy to tune that out and imagine what's going to be there. But yeah, I don't do too much comping or anything like that. It's quite basic.
Considering the way that Alex shot the movie, how long was your first assembly? Was it that much longer than the final runtime? And what were the areas that you felt you had to put the most amount of time in to get the film where you wanted it to be?
I think our first assembly was 2 hours 20. So we ultimately cut, what?
Like a half an hour, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Outside of the opening, whatever it amounted to, so let's say 7 minutes that we just cut altogether, nothing else structurally was removed. It was just, I mean, with action sequences, they can run very long. So we definitely would have taken time out of the ending. There was a few scenes in the White House that we cut out. They're just little mini sequences. You know, I'm always a big believer that films shouldn't really be more than 2 hours long. I mean, certain films demand it. I'm not criticizing any of the Dunes or anything else. That they can be great, but certainly the films I've made, you know, the closer to 100 minutes you can be, the better, really, in my view. At the same time, you want it to feel substantial. I don't think we ever was referring to this film as epic, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to feel too slight. But both Alex and I are very keen to make things feel as lean as possible.
You made a point a couple of times of talking about yourself being, you know, the first audience. Did you do screenings? And when you did, what kind of feedback did you get from the audience?
We only did one sort of test screening, as it were, for a big recruited audience, which was in New York, quite late on. Alex wanted to wait until we had pretty decent visual effects in place before. So at that stage, there's only so much you can do to change stuff. But at the same time, he doesn't think that you'll learn anything too valuable if there's too much that isn't right. The note we always got is the same note we get now, which is more context, you know, which is to some extent we've made adjustments. So if possible, to imagine there was even less context than before that screening than we end up managing to get in there. But that was the main thing. But no, really what we did throughout the sort of more pertinent bit in terms of the creative, Alex has a sort of stable of friends who aren't particularly involved in films, who he shows things to. But also we were lucky, we had some very esteemed, who do we have? Danny Boyle came and watched it, and Paul Greengrass came and watched it. And Chris Morris, who's a British filmmaker, comedian, friend of Alex's. And I think one other esteemed director, I can't now think. Anyway, so we got some, and they would just give us one-on-one feedback. We learned some stuff from them. At the same time, Alex, he's always interested in what people have to say, but at the same time, he's only ever going to go with what his gut tells him. So
that's what makes him Alex.
Yeah.
You put a lot of work into this one. It was a little while ago, and between then and now, you've been working on another movie, which you've talked about. You're actually finishing it up right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that sounds pretty cool. A little film called Alien Romulus, due out, I hope, this summer. How's that been going?
It's been going great. It's been a really fun experience. It's you know, literal childhood fantasy stuff, you know, monsters in space. That's pretty much, you know, why anyone of my generation wanted to make movies in the first place. So no, it's been a dream come true and really fun. And as it's been documented, to a large extent, it's all been done with practical effects. The film is set between the first and the second films and very much is a kindred spirit of those two films in terms of design and aesthetic and tone. We've certainly done our best to emulate those films, and it'd be hard to better them, but we hope we're going to be in their company. And no, it's been a really positive experience, and it's, you know, it's fun just working in action horror genres. It's on a scale and a canvas as big as we've been able to do. It's been great fun.
Is Jesse Plemons in this one too?
No, sadly not. Cailee Spaeny is. Caylie's the new, as it were, Ripley. It was really interesting cutting her back to back. I saw her at the LA screening of Civil War and reassured her that it didn't feel like cutting the same person each time. It was two very distinctly different people, so it didn't feel repetitive.
Sure, she appreciated that.
Yeah.
But see if you can fit Jesse in too. That guy can play anything, even the alien.
Yeah, he probably is in one of those suits.
I mean, really, how great is Jesse Plemons? That guy is top-notch. But of course, that is just my opinion. It is also my opinion that Jake Roberts, together with Alex Garland, made a fascinating and expertly crafted film with Civil War. A big thanks to Jake for squeezing out some time to talk to us while he's wrapping up Alien Romulus right now. Hopefully we can get him back on the podcast for that one. I will do my best. Speaking of doing one's best, I think you would be doing your best as an editor to flex your awesome editing talents on Avid Media Composer. None other than Hollywood's finest editors have described it as being an extension of their brain. I know that sounds creepy, but it's not. What it means is that the editing tools are powerful and precise, and become second nature to how you tell a story. That sounds like something you ought to experience. So get going on your journey to editorial greatness with Avid Media Composer. One little click of that link in the show notes can do big things for your storytelling talent. As for me, I am out of storytelling talent as far as this podcast goes. Nothing left to say today, other than I'm glad you were here. I always am, and I will be just as glad to see you again. Until the next one, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.